Thank you for joining us again at the FinCEN Report podcast. My name is Jonathan Wilson. I'm one of the founders here at the FinCEN Report company. As you know by now, we have a SaaS-based compliance solution that helps companies file their beneficial ownership reports under the Corporate Transparency Act. And we use this platform to talk to experts in the field to help gain perspective on the Corporate Transparency Act, anti-money laundering, and related topics. Today, we are really happy to have on the show Dr. Nicholas Gilmour. He is a PhD in financial crime who lives in New Zealand, and he is the author of The War on Dirty Money, a book that is full of analysis of how Western governments have tried to attack money laundering over the last several decades and what they need to do differently in order to succeed. So we are looking forward to talking with him about his book, The War on Dirty Money, and how he views the Corporate Transparency Act and our efforts to fight dirty money here in the United States. So stay tuned. So Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us here on the FinCEN Report. Glad to have you with us. You're talking to us today all the way from New Zealand.
Yes, that's right. And Jonathan, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, we were talking before we got started that you were originally from England. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and where you went to school and how you ended up on the other side of the world?
Yes, so it's quite interesting because my first 10 years of employment was as an aircraft electrician. So completely different field, but one that followed in the family footsteps of two generations. But my burning desire was always to be a police officer. And for those 10 years, my aim was to at some point jump ship and join the police. And when I was working away in a different factory, they were recruiting police officers in a different part of the United Kingdom. And yes, I applied and was successful. I managed 3 years before I was told they wanted police officers in New Zealand. Now, to my embarrassment, New Zealand was a country very far away, and that's about as much as I knew, although I'd heard of the All Blacks rugby team like most people. So, yes, we moved to New Zealand in 2003. I stayed here for 5 years, and then we had the opportunity to go overseas, where I worked for the UK Home Office back in the United Kingdom. And then a phone call one morning, was I interested in a job in the United Arab Emirates working for the Abu Dhabi police. And opportunities like that don't come about very often. So we decided to take a young family and move to the Middle East. And then, yes, I think New Zealand was always calling that we must come back. My wife was a Kiwi. Really great place to bring family. So we moved back, and I ended up working for the National Intelligence Centre in the police. And completed that time, and I'd done my doctorate in anti-money laundering, and and finished off in the Financial Intelligence Unit. And since 2017, I've been working as an independent consultant.
Got it. So you actually finished your PhD while you were in New Zealand?
Yes, well, I started it whilst I was working for the Home Office, and it was one of those conversations you had around a meeting table before the meeting actually started, and somebody said, well, if you're going to do study, whatever you do, don't have a family at the same time. And I said, well, I've just started my doctorate and my wife's pregnant. And there was this sigh of anxiousness from everybody in the meeting, and I completed it whilst I was in the United Arab Emirates. So yes, it was nice to I guess, work away in a different environment whilst studying, whilst bringing up a family. So I guess if you can manage those three things, you can basically accomplish anything in life.
Sure. Well, congratulations on managing to juggle all of those different responsibilities. That is quite an accomplishment.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And I can imagine, having lived in, by my count, at least 3 different countries, you've developed quite a perspective on the way business gets done, and as it relates to our topic of money laundering, how financial transactions get done.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that my ambition to always join the police was driven by early books that I read in the mid-90s. That distraction of just that comprehension of how organised crime could be so successful, and its successfulness was ultimately gained from its ability to launder the illicit funds. to benefit from that financial gain. And not necessarily just for buying those commodities and those glitzy glamour things that we see now, but very much that ability to invest in future crime. And I guess for the last 30 years, I've just been really enthused by that successfulness of organised crime. And I guess that's what led me really into, led me into that wanting to understand money laundering as it currently exists. And of course, you're right. I'm seeing the changes within the United Kingdom with the Proceeds of Crime Act and how that influenced the law enforcement approach to dealing with organised crime and sources of cash and actual physical cash and how we managed it. To then see how it was dealt with in the United Arab Emirates. And we all know that the UAE is very much still going through a process of being having been grey listed. They're now going through a great alteration to their entire system. And we know that Dubai and that region does have a lot of illicit cash history to it. Dubai was made very much through a smuggling region. And then, of course, we've got this change with the obviously, unfortunately, the Panama Papers and the influence of how New Zealand was drawn into that as well. So you do see varying different levels of change depending on how that country is under the spotlight.
Sure. And obviously, you're the co-author of a book, The War on Dirty Money, which I'm sure is informed by your perspective from all those different jurisdictions. If you had to sum it up in a sentence, what is the primary takeaway that we should have from your book?
It's a global book, but a global book of solutions. So it's a book of solutions on all aspects of anti-money laundering and the war on dirty money. So it's a global book. It's not regional. So although both Tristram and I have regional perspectives, we've written it for a global audience.
Sure. Well, here in the United States, we're very much focused on our Corporate Transparency Act, which for the first time is going to end corporate anonymity in the United States. It's going to require almost every company in the U.S. that isn't already regulated somehow to file a document with FinCEN that identifies the beneficial owners of the company. Now, my understanding is that the U.K. already has a similar system in place in which beneficial owners are identified to the state somehow.
Yes, and now I must admit I'm no UK expert on this, but let's look at this as an idea. Now, it's only very much a positive idea. It's only going to benefit the proactive move to dealing with the hiding of illicit wealth and the ability to control who has and who is doing things with what they shouldn't be doing, really. And it's a step in the right direction, and I hope it has success. And I certainly hope it has success in countries like the US. But ultimately, we need to remember sometimes that if you're a money launderer or if you're a person who's involved in this, you're going to find ways around the problems. You're going to be able to circumvent. And I fear that in maybe 5-10 years' time, we'll have realized just how these people have manipulated a system which we thought when we brought in as a practice and we adopted it and implemented it successfully, that actually it was just being laughed at. We were just, it was a mockery. I'm very much like Tristram is when we wrote the book, an optimist that things will change for the better. And I guess when I summed up the book and saying it's a book of solutions, it is a book of solutions. We didn't want to be critical of such as these new adoptions that we're seeing globally, that we criticize them or pull them apart. We actually provide a critique of current processes, but we provide some solutions to take these ideas forward. Because at the end of the day, we've spent the last 33 years, thanks to the Financial Action Task Force, adopting new practices, constantly evolving. but also we've seen a huge evolvement of organized criminality, of illicit finance, and the way it's moved around the world and the way it's controlled. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we've got a long journey to travel on, unfortunately.
Sure. So from the American perspective, as a practicing lawyer like me, giving advice to ordinary, privately owned companies, we have 30 million companies that are going to have to file these forms for the first time. And, the vast majority of them, nearly 100% of them, I'm sure, are all legitimate businesses who are burdened with having the process of filling out the forms and collecting the documents and finding a way to file them and so on and so forth. And they're going to go through all that effort to questionable results. We really don't know how many bad actors we're going to get. And someone compared it to me recently that if you can remember back a few decades ago at the beginning part of the war on terrorism, we had the one fellow go through that tried to blow up a plane because he hit a bomb in his shoe. And then for the next 20 years, every time we get on a plane, we all have to take our shoes off. Yeah. What does that accomplish, really?
Jonathan, I think you raise a good point there, and that is we struggle to measure prevention. But we need to have some justification that the preventative measures that we adopt are justifiable, are able to do something to try and hamper the manipulation of the systems that we have in place, which are there to facilitate normal general business practices, legal business practices. But we need to try and to understand that although you say 99.9% of the businesses, shall we say, are legitimate, we've known over the years that organized criminality will adopt legitimate-looking businesses to facilitate their illicit side of the businesses. And that's one of the successes of them. And I see that's probably one of the Trojan horses, shall we say, scenarios of future criminality, is that they will blend into general normal society, and it will be the visual organized criminal, the one that we would identify from maybe 20, 30 years ago from television, who stood out as being an organized criminal, or somebody who makes some silly mistakes because they're either greedy or over ambitious. But generally, criminality will blend into normal society. And that's the worrying thing, is that we will adopt practices and processes without necessarily understanding that these people are already inside the office, inside the building, inside the talking environment as well. The discussion, they will sit around these tables at these discussions. And I think that's not a case of being paranoid. It's a case of understanding, in our case, our opponent, the other people we're trying to deal with.
Sure. So we think about, here in America, where there was the television program Breaking Bad, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where, the key money launderer there literally bought a car washing business and laundered his money through the car wash business, a very prosaic, ordinary sort of business,
Yes. So, but that's not too far. That's not too far off reality. You look at programs such as Ozark, you look at large amounts of cash obtained by criminal gangs, they need to do something with it. And if they can use an established business, and they can use similar established businesses with similar banking credibility, then it's a perfect business to use. Why would you go out of the norm? Your whole assessment as a money launderer is to sit in with the least amount of risk. Put yourself in the least risky place. Because if you've done and facilitated the criminal act, which money laundering is then the final stage, you don't want to mess it up.
Sure. So to take your example from Ozarks, if you're willing to engage in all the criminal acts that the parties did in that show, then having someone lie on their Corporate Transparency Act form is just one more crime to a pile of crimes you've already committed.
Yes.
And so that law would not find that particular sort of illegality.
I think one of the things that you say is that is very much is the complication of we don't need to overcomplicate money laundering, but we need to understand that money laundering is not just a simple placement, layer, and integration. There are lots of other things that will go on in the background to facilitate what is essentially probably the most important criminal act that the criminal will now do.
That's right. That's right. So if I remember, one of the, I think we wrote about it on the blog a while back, our FinCEN had to make a report to Congress on the outcome of its suspicious activity reports. And what it found out is that they knew exactly how many SARs they had collected, but they couldn't actually trace the SARs to any particular crimes being found out or prevented. It wasn't even clear the SARs were being used as they were intended, sort of casting a question mark over the entire enterprise as to, is it really preventing crime by requiring all of these banks to fill out all these forms to send up all these reports if no one ever acts on them?
Yes. And I think there's a couple of points there with SARs, that there is very much an obligation to complete them. But the level of obligation, of course, will fluctuate between business entities and professional businesses, and even times of the year, perhaps, and the necessity of a potential visit by a regulator globally in terms of, well, should we be putting in SARs? So you've got that difference of SARs, but we're looking at maybe 33, 34 million SARs a year being submitted globally. And that's a lot of information. Now, as long as those SARs are really suspicious activities and actually put in for the right reasons, submitted for the right reasons, then yes, you're right. The controlling body who receives those has a lot of information. Now, one of the things that we point to in the book is that SARs are really good, but they need to be used. It's no good having those SARs placed into a black hole, which is essentially the financial intelligence unit, who controls those and is able to view those. Because at the end of the day, unless you put that information together with law enforcement, who can have open and readily access to that SAR information, to those huge amount of SARs, then actually they're very much a waste of time. Because the SARs will be good at informing the financial intelligence unit, who will need to create its annual risk assessment. And yes, they may use that as an indication. But from our experience, actually, the SARs are not getting to the end user, which is law enforcement. And we know typically that the whole purpose of money laundering is to distance the money from the original crime. And the greater that distance, the likelihood is the more successful you will be going forward. Law enforcement will not be able to attribute that cash that you have in your control back to original criminality.
I was going to say, it sounds like there is a disconnect then between financial intelligence, which is collecting SARs, some of which are perhaps actionable from a law enforcement point of view, and the actual law enforcement decision makers and actors who are pursuing whatever investigations they're pursuing, but they aren't aware of the SARs. Is it a problem of law enforcement coordinating with financial intelligence and vice versa?
Yes, and it very much represents what money launderers are trying to do. Is they're trying to create that distance. Now, we're creating that through a common practice. Now, it's probably a community. The whole idea of our book was to generate discussion. Now, if we can generate discussion around bringing people in an FIU, in the FinCENs and the law enforcement agencies together, and we say, right, how can we better our approach to deal with illicit finance? How can we deal with money laundering? How can we put the pieces of the jigsaw together? Well, we've got this information. Well, we would like that information. Now, there is a lot of discussion globally around partnership work and information sharing. And there will always be those issues around sensitive information being shared with people who don't necessarily have the clearance or the ability to control how it's shared. And we all know that once you share something, you've lost control of it. But there is still that need to put the pieces of the jigsaw together because, yes, you have all that information submitted by banking institutions who suspect a suspicious activity has occurred, yet you have law enforcement thinking, wow, if we knew there was something going on behind what we initially see, we could actually do something about it. And it's that law enforcement side that we actually, and this is not because both Tristram and I are from law enforcement backgrounds, it's that idea that we need to bring law enforcement more into the war on dirty money, because currently we're very much focused on a compliance side, which is very much focused on prevention. But again, prevention is really hard to categorize as being successful.
What is it that law enforcement needs? Do they need more training to understand what to look for? I mean, in my career, I had been, in-house with a website hosting company for a few years.
Yes.
And this was in the early 2000s at the height of the war on terror. And we were often seeing information requests and subpoenas from law enforcement who were clearly looking for terrorist financiers. And it became clear that they didn't know what they were looking for. The form of the subpoena would say, give us all information about this person and that person and any of the records indicated on Exhibit A. And Exhibit A was always the same. It was like every law enforcement entity in the United States had taken the same document and photocopied it over and over and over again. And it was containing all of the types of jargon that you would use to talk about the internet circa 1995. It was asking for internet screen names and chat rooms and mail lists and things that no one was using in 2005. They were using them in 1995. But no one had ever bothered to tell law enforcement. So what I would often do is pick up the phone and talk to law enforcement and say, well, what is it that you're really looking for? And often the individual who was running the subpoena didn't even have their own computer. They would have to go down the hallway to borrow the central computer that all the police officers shared in order to look at a website or figure out what it was that they were trying to do. And it just pointed to, I think, perhaps a lack of training, a lack of resources, a lack of focus on the part of law enforcement. Is that part of what your recommendation is?
Yes, very much so. And I think, look, let's be honest here. In 1990, we had no real idea about money laundering. And the Financial Action Task Force took money laundering, ran with it, and over 30 years later have managed to adopt legislation in over 200 countries. So they've adopted financial intelligence units. So we have made huge progress. But we have to remember that we've really carried on the initial ideas of what money laundering is right from those initial days. So we still think that money laundering is placement, layer, and integration. And there are businesses and financial institutions and professional sectors who will believe money laundering is placement, layer, and integration. But on the other side of the fence, shall we say, of the same group of guys and girls who want to prevent, you have law enforcement who are working to an entirely different understanding of what money laundering is. And we need to bring those people together. But we need to give law enforcement the skills and the knowledge and the capability in greater numbers. Now, we are spending globally over 210 billion US dollars annually on AML compliance. And that number's only going up. And it will only continue to grow up with the fear of greater fines. And the fines is an entire discussion on its own. So we could just talk about fines on these sectors separately. But as these fines go up, there's the reaction to spend more money. And much of that money is going on software solutions, IT solutions, AI, machine learning. Now, you look at the other side, you look at law enforcement who don't have a budget because their budget is so small, we don't actually calculate what it is that they're spending globally on an annual basis. So we need to move some of that technology, shift it over and see a greater benefit from the enforcement side. Now, we can't calculate prevention necessarily, but we can start taking confiscation, and we can start taking people to court and having them answer to a judge and having them go to prison. And that's where law enforcement needs greater support. But yes, that education is necessary. And I don't think we have enough discussions around, hang on a second, who knows what money laundering is, and who knows how it's happening today, and have those full and frank conversations. And I think until we start to do so, I don't think all the pieces of the jigsaw will come together.
So I think one of your policy prescriptions then would be to shift some of the focus from compliance and prevention onto law enforcement training and coordination between financial intelligence and law enforcement itself.
Oh, very much so. And we will see that being adopted globally. But you've got, or regionally, sorry, in countries like Australia and the US might try it, Canada might try it, the UK. You will have those partnerships, certain countries in Europe will do it, where they have those partnerships working. But a physical shift of the technology from from compliance over into law enforcement would be great. I mean, it's not that law enforcement globally are dealing with old, antiquated computer systems anymore. If you look at the UK's national intelligence system, it's really quite successful. It's very well funded. But we're talking adoption of cybercrime teams, of fraud teams, and having a greater resource in law enforcement would only do us good in the war on dirty money.
Well, Dr. Nicholas Gilmour, thank you very much for those insights. I only wish that we could find you a better platform to offer your thoughts to policymakers in the U.S. and elsewhere, so that we could implement some of these. What opportunities do you see in the near term for governments to consider and adopt some of your policy prescriptions?
Well, because the book's global, I think the recommendations that we list in the back of each of the chapters under what we call the solutions toolbox will start to generate those discussions. And I think where we see people wanting to try and reinvent the wheel because their success has come to an end, they will start to see those as being an opportunity, we hope, to generate new ideas or to actually go back to a clean sheet of paper. But actually, it's like anything. Unfortunately, it will take another event of some sort to really kickstart a new approach to what is effectively a very, very old problem. But unfortunately, we don't really want that event, or fortunately, we don't want that event to happen, but we do want people to start discussing it. And having conversations like we're having today and others, I think will only stand us in good stead for a positive future.
Well, let's hope so. Here's hoping. So, Dr. Nicholas Gilmour, The War on Dirty Money. It's a book that we would encourage our audience to read. At the end of the program, we're going to have an information slide with information about how people can get your book, and would love to have our readers read it and comment on it on our comment pages. Any final thoughts, Dr. Gilmour?
No, thank you for having us. It's been a great opportunity. And if anybody wishes to discuss in the future, we're more than happy to share our thoughts.
Absolutely. Nicholas' contact information will be available at the end of the presentation. Definitely encourage you to reach out to him if he is someone who could speak to your audience, to your organization. Thanks again for joining us, Dr. Gilmour. Thank you, audience, for joining us, and stay tuned for more information from time to time here on the FinCEN Report.